Hello, and welcome to this episode of Musically Cogitating, a podcast about the relevance and importance of living in contemporary music of all kinds and about how that music impacts our everyday lives. I am your host, Ciyadh. Thank you for listening to yet another episode of this podcast, which I really love and enjoy doing, so thank you so much for continuing to listen. As always, any important and relevant links will be in the show notes. Today, I have something a little special for you. I have a solo episode of the Musically Cogitating podcast book club. And let me know what you think about the idea of a solo book club. The next one will have a co-host, but I decided to go alone for this one because the book that I'm going to be sharing with you and kind of talking through is pretty small, and it's an interest that I have, and while I'm sure that others have this interest, I thought it would just be best if I tackled it all by my lonesome, and I'm excited to share that with you. So today we are going, or we as in me, I'm going to discuss a zine. And if you don't know what a zine is like a magazine, and it is usually themed around a specific topic, and the person who has created it is usually like really passionate about the topic and really knows a lot about it. So zines come in all different shapes and sizes. I mean, there are photography zines where there are just photos. There are poetry zines. There are literary zines. There are literary magazines. But zines are usually a little bit more DIY, a little bit more underground, a little bit more indie. And so I love zines. I don't have a big collection of zines, but I do have some, and I have produced a few. I'm going to produce more in the future, and so I just love a zine. So that's what a zine is. And so today I wanted to discuss this zine called Why to Resist Streaming Music and How. And it is by Joe Steinhardt, and this was actually published by Microcosm Publications, which is a independent publisher out of Portland, Oregon. And I'm also reading another one of their books about how to start an independent publishing company, which is really great so far. So if you're an artist or an artsy type, or you're just interested in what they have to do, I'll definitely link their website below because it's really cool. But yeah, today's book zine is going to be Why to Resist Streaming Music and How. Oh, and I found out about this particular zine because I received their newsletter, and I open all of the newsletters that I receive in my email inbox, and if I don't read them very closely, I read them enough to know kind of what's going on. And I saw that and I was like, this is right in, my interest. This is like peak Ciyadh, peak Musically Cogitating podcast interests. They aligned, they intersected. And so that's why we're talking about it today. Supporting artists is, of course, really important to me, and it's really important to the show because, after all, I too am an artist, and while I may not make all of my income from being on a stage per se, everything that I do is in some way involved with art and music, and so I do make a living from this. And there are a lot of people who their only source of income is being on stage and some of the kind of adjacent income streams that come with that. And so, streaming, which has become ubiquitous and just such a big part of how music is consumed and shared, especially over the last, I want to say 5 years or 10 years if you were kind of early to that, it's been a hot button issue for independent and smaller artists. And yeah, I talked about streaming on the show. I will continue to do so. And I have my, positive thoughts on streaming. I have my not so positive thoughts on streaming. But, it's important that we discuss streaming and the way that we consume music, and also kind of the pros and cons that come along with consuming music pretty much only via the means of streaming. So, again, the book that I'm going to discuss, or the zine that I'm going to discuss, is Why to Resist Streaming Music and How. And the author of this zine, Joe Steinhardt, owns a record label called Don Giovanni Records. And I believe they started in the early 2000s, and they were and still are a pretty small operation. And he says that in the early days, as is even a small operation, they were able to really support and pay their artists via, music purchasing and some of the other sources of revenue that come along with running a record label and producing music and things like that. But as companies, like larger companies like the Sonys and the Universals and the Capitals of the world started to show up, they began to really kind of dictate the rules of the music industry and, of course, of streaming. And Spotify was the leader in this movement towards streaming. Of course, there was Napster, there was iTunes, where you could purchase and download, when you still can purchase and download, but we're talking primarily about streaming music, not when someone purchases and downloads an MP3. So he divides the zine up into kind of like some little subheadings. So the first heading is the rise of streaming music. And he discusses and talks about how streaming became such a part of our culture and how we listen to music, how we share music, what we expect of music and of art. And so he defines streaming. He says that it has multiplied almost 30 times what it was maybe in the last 5 years, and is worth, of course, billions and billions and billions of dollars, more money than I have the ability to comprehend. And he makes a point that I really, really enjoyed and love and agree with, is that tech companies aren't often run by artists themselves. And so because these companies aren't run by artists, they're not really always keeping the best interests of the artist at the center. And they're probably not always keeping the best interests of the consumer at the middle or the center of it as well, because they control so much of it. So we as consumers, in a way, we just kind of have to be okay with whatever it is that they come up with. But and I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure that the people who started Spotify were artists. But we know iTunes and Apple Music and things like that. A lot of the people who work there are artists, yes. And they're also engineers, people who have an interest in art from a perspective of, like profit and revenue, more so than art, because art is important and we want to share that with everybody. They being these tech companies, have changed our lives in such a way that they've made it less convenient and more difficult to consume non-streamed music. And the author goes on to say that Joe, the author, he says that he doesn't personally stream music. And so I would really love to talk to him actually about this point in particular, but more on that hopefully in a future episode. A lot of the streaming music stuff was started by one or two companies, and it didn't get big until probably the last 5-10 years. And there was, he says, a peak of music purchasing in around the early 2000s, where people were spending, I think, an average of like $64 a year on purchasing music. So this a lot of times includes physical music, so CDs, cassettes, vinyls, and then at this time MP3s, which were also part of it. But again, a lot of this change was driven in the music industry by these large companies, and it was driven for profit, not for quality. And the thing about streaming in general is that it is built around this idea of quantity over quality. And in the past couple of months, okay, we'll say years, just because, we will. I would say that for me personally, quality has become more and more important. And so I've begun to invest more money in things that will allow for there to be better quality in my music listening and, streaming experience. And I don't know that quality matters to a lot of people, although a lot of people really enjoy their AirPods and their Beats Pro or their Microsoft Surface headphones. So I think quality does matter to people, but they often think of quality in terms of like the hardware. So the headphones, the phone, the speakers that they're listening to, whatever is in their car, and not so much about the quality of the file that they're listening to. So that could be the MP3 download, or that could be the stream. It matters to the people it matters to. I'm one of those people that it matters to. And so it's important to kind of keep that going for, not only the sake of quality being mattering, but also for the sake of artists being supported and continuing to be able to make a career creating art. So I just mentioned that people used to spend an average of $64 a year on purchasing music. Well, people spend more money on music now via streaming, and artists make less and less of that money. People will often say, well, I'm streaming, I am spending, $120 a year or more just on music, right? That doesn't take into account maybe if you have Netflix or cable or some other types of streaming services, Audible and things like that. But they will ask how they can help. And Joe says that the only answer to being able to help is not to stream. And I'm not sure if that is, the only answer. This zine is about not streaming. And so, of course, he, as a person who is really passionate about this and somewhat of, an expert in not only record labels and the record industry, but in, this fight against streaming music, would say that. So I don't know if, not streaming is the only answer. I think changing the entire model is part of the answer, but in the end of the zine, he discusses why that's not really possible, and so we will get there shortly. There are some economic costs of streaming music that we think about, or maybe we don't, or that are kind of invisible to us. And one of those kind of costs is that streaming exists on this kind of rent a center model. And if you're not familiar with rent a center and these types of businesses, they are businesses that basically allow you to rent and or rent to own or lease whatever it is that they sell. So the product. So rent a center, I think, is usually like household furnishings, which are great and are making things more accessible for people in terms of, being able to have the things that they need to survive. But in music, you're just renting that stream for forever and ever, in perpetuity. Like, we will be paying for Spotify until you don't want to pay anymore. And if you don't want to pay anymore, that's fine. But if you're a person who really enjoys music, in any of these models, in any of these platforms, it's kind of like, what are you going to do? And not renting your music for forever may work for some people, but for a lot of people, because of the way that the whole industry has changed, it's probably not going to really work. Now, in addition to this kind of rent-a-center model that streaming services are, there's also this trend of minimalism that I think plays into and supports the idea of streaming and renting. And owning less things is good if that is something that you're interested in. And you may not want to have your CDs and your tapes and your vinyl because, it does take up space. I am fortunate enough to have an area of my home where I can have all of my vinyl, all of my CDs, all of my cassettes, and it's easily accessible, and I can flip my records and it's really easy, but everyone might not have room and space for all of that. So I can see why you might want to stream music because it just takes up less physical space. But at the end of the day, you don't own any of that. You don't own anything on Spotify. You can download it, sure, but once you stop paying, it's just going to be wiped from your phone or from your streaming device. So, is that really the way that you want to go about it? I don't know. And I'll talk about kind of my final thoughts and what I'm going to do moving forward at the end, but it's just a question I kind of want to leave you with. One of the other kind of economic costs or not so great things about streaming and streaming music is the payment system. And so he goes into way more depth than I can now. And I think you should also buy the zine because it's not too expensive, and it really supports great artists and organization and for business and microcosm. But they talk about how the payment system is not really a pay per stream model. And I think we assume that because especially when you go on Spotify, you can see, theoretically how many times this song has been streamed. And so you might be thinking, oh, okay, like this song has been streamed 150,000 times. That's great. This person has received X amount of money. And that is not how it works at all. I'm going to try to describe it. He says that basically the value of a stream changes from month to month relative to the amount of songs streamed and to the amount of revenue that the service makes. So it's kind of like there's this big pot, and the value of the pot, the value of the stream, how much an artist will make off of that changes. He mentions that it's problematic for a lot of reasons, and the main reason that I kind of agree with it being problematic is that streaming music platforms are built to promote what is most popular at any given time, and not for independent musicians like you or myself, us just normal people who are interested in making music, who in another lifetime or in previous times might have been able to really support ourselves off of physical music downloads and not streaming, but downloads and buying physical media, but can't really do so right now. So ultimately, the model and payment system of streaming, he says, is that most of your streaming subscription revenue goes to the top 1% of artists on the platform. So there are artists who have really strong fan bases who are not the top 1% of that platform and who do make money off of streaming, but it's not really probably as many of those people as we think. And one of the next sections is that artists cannot make a living, which is kind of, a really, like I said, a really important part of the idea of resisting streaming music. And also it's just a part of something that I believe in. Artists should be able to make money off of our art if we want to. The top 10% of songs on those platforms often account for 99% of all of the streams on that platform. So he presents some great stats about how artists can't make a living off of streaming, because you might have a song that, say, over the span of 3 years, just a random span I'm picking there, might get 1 million streams, but that might only yield about $3,000. So you're making about $1,000 a year off of streaming pre-tax. And that's it. That's that one song. That's if one song hits. That is if, you're able to keep that momentum. If people really enjoy it. That's if you get paid, because I'm sure that streaming, and I know this for a fact, that it takes a really long time for that money to get to the artists. So it's not really a reliable source of income for most artists. Yes, there are some who can make a reliable income off of streaming, but that's not how it is for most people who are, independent, who have small record labels, who are doing it themselves, and who are just trying to get their music out there and trying to get it in people's headphones and things like that. It really used to be possible, like I said, for an artist to make money off of their music, regardless of the size of their following. But now, because of the way that streaming works, because of this payout model, it's not as possible. The next part that he goes into, which is really interesting, is that there is this cultural cost of streaming. And I'm so fascinated by the way that people consume music and art broadly. So I talk about it probably every couple of episodes. I make some kind of statement about art and consumption and things like that. So I love that he talks about the culture and the costs that we as people have in our culture around, making streaming music the way that most people will continue to consume music. I love talking about culture because, music is such a part of it. We go to concerts, we talk about music with our friends, we share it via text, we make each other playlists. Again, that's, streaming. But in the olden days, we'd make each other mix tapes and CDs, and I haven't done that in a long time, but I have the capability to do so now. So some of you will be receiving a CD at some point from me. But, how we do music, how we listen to music, how we share music is so fascinating. And it's such a part of our lives. And he says this in the zine, and I think I've said this in a previous episode, that a lot of people who are proponents and fans or supporters of music streaming say that they love it because of music discovery. And that's kind of true. Yes, but that's not the only, like streaming services are not the only way to discover new music. And I bet that you're not discovering as much new music on the streaming service as you think, because as with anything digital streaming wise, I always believe that you get into it what you get out of it, what you put in. So if you put a lot of time and energy and effort into searching for more artists, listening to more playlists, being curious and all of that, then you will, yes, get more out of it. You will discover more new music. But is the average person putting in that much effort? I don't know, because I'm not the average person. And I think that a lot of people that I talk to about this are not the average person. Like, they're not the average kind of music consumer. I think a lot of people that I talk to are, they're my friends. And so we have this like really deep interest in music and in music discovery. So I don't know, but I would love to know if you feel like, you're kind of like a casual music listener, and are you putting a lot of time and effort into the platform? Because I'm going to venture to guess that most people aren't putting that much because they just don't have the time and they just don't see it as important. So yeah, I'm not really convinced that music discovery is like the sole reason why streaming is so important. Sure, it is for some artists. Sure, some artists go viral and they get big on a platform, and that's great, but that's not happening for most people. He talks about some of the other kinds of pre-streaming but also current discovery tools, and these are ones that I, me being the not average music consumer and listener, still kind of use. So he mentions record store owners, and yes, record store owners are a special kind of people, and they know a lot about music, and they can recommend you and tell you everything. They're curators, they may not say that, but like, they're curators, and so they have the knowledge that is vast. They can help you discover. There are, of course, music magazines and blogs, which I read, and I think a lot of people still read. I get the newsletters, I read them, they're still sending them to me, so I'm going to assume that more than just me reads them. Other artists are a great way to discover new music, new art, and of course, like liner notes, and which, people like, there are not liner notes in digital music without putting some effort into it. And so in streaming music, there are liner notes for, when you purchase like an MP3 download, but not for streaming music normally. So, but that is still a way to discover, new music. Now, he does have this chapter or this kind of subheading about laws and the way that copyright policy and public policy and issues with piracy and infringement have really not been great for artists, especially since streaming music has gotten big. And so I'm not going to go into that because I don't really know much about copyright law and policy, but I will just say that again, if you read this, really, really take in what he has to say about it. And he says some interesting things. Now, the one point in the book that was really, really, really interesting to me was that there is an environmental cost to streaming. And in one of the first few episodes, I talked about a project called Trash Music, which was a project that I will do again in the future about, art and sustainability. And I think that from the point of the average consumer, we believe, or we are taught to think, that there are absolutely zero environmental costs to streaming music because we don't see it. We don't know where the stream came from. It just appeared in our phone. So surely that means that zero carbon was emitted into our atmosphere by our streaming. And that's just not really true according to what he said. But also, if you think about it, it's just not true. It's just not something that we as consumers of the things that people want us to continue to consume are, told information about. And so he kind of says that he kind of compares streaming to like a disposable cup. Streaming is something that once you listen to it, it's disposed of. It's gone. And with music streaming, and because people can be, really into a song, that song can be streamed over and over. It can be disposed of hundreds of million, if not, billions of times. So each stream that you listen to is created just for you in that very moment. And it's not really reusable in any way. It's not recycled. Once you've listened to it, that's over. He also says, and this is an important point, that our music streaming devices are disposable as well. So, we have our cell phones, we have our computers. I have an MP3 player, but at some point those devices are going to die because companies don't want to make them easy to repair or change the battery in. And so we have to get a new one because, again, all of our music is there, but also every other thing that we do for our lives, the way that we communicate to each other, is on some type of digital device for most people in my context, which is the United States. So he then kind of makes the argument, and I like this argument, that physical media is better because it is reusable and it lasts longer. So there are people who, like myself, we have albums since like the 60s in our collections, and they still sound great. That has existed, that someone made it once, and I've been able to reuse it and replay it over and over and over again for, what is now like 50 or more years. And that's really important. Like, we talk a lot about sustainability and, making sure that things last. Well, why don't we make sure that our music and our music media lasts, right? We have to make sure that it can be reused and it can be shared, and that people can continue listening to it and consuming it and enjoying it, and that it's not just thrown away and not really thought about ever again. Doesn't make physical media better, of course, because there is an environmental cost and footprint to producing vinyl and to producing CDs and compact discs, which are CDs, and other forms of physical media. But in terms of durability, in terms of their ability to last, as long as the record player is around, that CD, and record players are more in nowadays, that vinyl is going to continue. And he says kind of that it wasn't that people weren't interested in physical media anymore. It's that tech companies and record companies, the ones that control how we consume our media, and a lot of times just weren't interested anymore. They're looking for ways to make more revenue, more profit for themselves, not for the artists. And so they just kind of changed the ways that we consume music. And he makes a point that in all parts of the world, it is not like this. I would say in America, because that's my context, that's where I live, that's what I know, that most people stream music and they have no device in their house, or they don't know anyone who could get them a CD player if I sent them a mixed CD. But he says that in Japan, and of course, like I've not been to Japan, so I don't know if this is really true, but he does say that it is kind of the opposite, where streaming music accounts for like 20% of all the music that people in Japan consume, and people there are still buying CDs and vinyl and things like that. So, it's not like this everywhere. It's just kind of here. So, interesting to think about. Ultimately, he says that there are no alternatives to the, quote unquote, all you can eat streaming model. And there are no alternatives because of the way that the system is built by the three largest record labels, and then the companies that they are in partnership with, because they have a lot of influence. And so this is a direct quote. He says, "We need a future where alternative voices are not forced to exist within the corporate structure, but can stand as true alternatives to them." And I like this idea for pretty much everything. I think that there should be room and space for alternative voices within every structure, and that we should actually, it's not that the voices need to be within the structure. We need to have our own structure, somewhere to be, somewhere to support, and somewhere to exist. And so with this, I agree. Do I agree that there are no alternatives? I'm not sure. I really need to think about this and to really dream about, what is the streaming model really, and how could it be better, and how could it be better for a really large group of people. So yeah, maybe there are no alternatives, but I think that there could be an alternative, that we just have to really, really think about it. And so in true fashion, in a good zine, they're like this one, which is supposed to be kind of like educational and is advocating for something, kind of specific. He leaves us with action items, and he gives us 3 action items. He says, stream as little music as possible, that you should cancel your subscription, and that you should advocate for audiences not to stream and instead buy or download music. And by download, buy MP3s, and then buy like physical CDs, vinyl, cassettes, 8 tracks if you have one of those, although I'm pretty sure no one is producing those anymore. And so, my final thoughts on this is that this is like peak in my interest, right? Like, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So when I discovered this, I was like, this is an instant podcast episode, which is really great. And I think my final thoughts are that, yes, I agree about the environmental footprint. Yes, I agree that artists cannot really make a living off of streaming in the way that we think that they can, and that we need to do something about it. Whether or not that means just like bulldozing streaming and like burning it down to the ground, I don't know. And that's going to take some time for me to think about and tease out of there. But what I am going to do is I am going to start purchasing more downloads digitally, of course, and that means that my physical media collection is going to grow, which is fine by me. I'm probably going to regret saying that the next time that I move, but for now, I'm just going to have all of these CDs and all these vinyls and all these cassettes everywhere. And so I, at some point, we'll write about this, about my recent acquisition, which is like an MP3 player, which again, I put music on it that I have digitally downloaded and have paid for. So it's not streamed, right? Like I own the digital download. So that's something I'm gonna write about in the future, but something that I want to share. I'm going to continue to advocate for independent artists like myself, because this is important, and I hope that listening to this show, this solo book club episode, that you see it as important. I assume that you do if you're listening to this. So yeah. And of course, I'm going to continue having the conversation around the cultural costs of streaming, and like I said, the environmental costs of streaming. So those are kind of my thoughts and my review and overview of why to resist streaming music and how. Like I said, I really, really enjoyed this zine, and I could not recommend you purchasing it enough and supporting, independent authors and publishers and things like that. I'm going to do a book club in the future on a similar topic about, the why streaming music became so like really specifically about why streaming music became so big, and kind of like the copyright and antitrust and things like that came along with that. So that'll be in the future. But for now, I think this was a really great introduction into, how people, or how this one person and how I do think about streaming music. That's not to say that I am not going to still talk about music apps and those kinds of technologies, because they're really fun for me and it's important to me as well. So I'm really looking for greater balance in there, and using some of the discovery tools to discover artists on streaming platforms, and then eventually just going to purchase the physical edition or buying the digital copy. So this week's music recommendation is False Alarms by Lawrence, and they are so good. If you don't know who they are, I hope that you enjoy them as much as I do, because their music is really awesome. So don't forget to follow the podcast on social media and to visit the podcast website, musicallycogitating.com. We have a newsletter which you can subscribe to. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and review. I see all of those, and I appreciate everyone who has left one so far. You can buy a sticker and a bookmark set. Yes, buy a bookmark and a sticker, because you're going to use that bookmark in your zine. But you can buy those through the link in the show notes. So on my Buy Me a Coffee page, or the support the show link in the notes. So that's all I have for you. I'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of the Musically Cogitating Podcast. Until then.